can't think of anything worse than losing a child. A previous guest on the show, award-winning actor Jason Watkins, talked on this podcast about losing his 2.5-year-old daughter Maudie to sepsis. The pain must be unbearable. Child Bereavement UK is a quite brilliant charity that supports children, young people, parents and families when either a child grieves or a child dies. For the last 3 years, my daughters and I have had the privilege of singing at their annual carol concert in December, and the outpouring of thanks from parents and families about how child bereavement has supported them and continues to support them in the worst of all circumstances is truly humbling, moving, and inspiring. If you know of someone in these circumstances who needs their help, or if you'd like to support the work that they do, either by donating or giving your time, please contact them via their website, www.childbereavementuk.org. Every penny and every effort will make a difference. Thank you. Hello and welcome to Bandwidth Conversations, a podcast that finds out about the stories and journeys of artists, performers, and rock stars of life. My guest today tells stories in a way that few others can. His writing contains such beauty, it's almost lyrical. His characters are drawn so cleverly, they become instantly familiar and adored friends. As for his storylines, they are so varied, rich, and surprising. You can almost feel your imagination stretching as you read, and you certainly never know what's coming next. He is a best-selling author, having started out as an investment banker. His books have been on the New York Times bestseller list. One of them was voted Book of the Year by Amazon, and another has just been adapted for television starring Ewan McGregor, his finest role, I think, and can be seen on Paramount+. You'll instantly recognize the titles as they are the books everyone is talking about. The Rules of Civility, A Gentleman in Moscow, The Lincoln Highway, A Table for Two. I've read and adored all of them, and I can't believe my luck that I get to talk today to Amor Towles. Amor, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me, Kitty.
Looking back to your childhood, when was the moment when words, writing, and stories first captured your imagination?
The best way I can answer the question is to say that I really knew I wanted to be a writer in first grade. And what had happened was that my first grade teacher had invited a poet to come visit the class. He was a well-known juvenile poet in the Northeastern United States at the time, meaning a writer of poetry for the young. His name was David McCord. And so he came to the class and he read from his poetry as we all sat on the rug in a circle in the manner of first grade. And I just remember loving everything about it. I loved the way that his poems were basically observations around simple things, sort of little everyday moments or objects. I loved the rhyming schemes. I loved the metrical quality of it. I loved how we were all gathered around listening. Then he signed our books, which was very exciting. And so I just remember going home that night and being like, that's what I want to do. And so I began that night writing poems that were versions of what he was doing. And that kind of just launched me off. And then from then on, reading and writing were conjoined practices. They're two different disciplines that went side by side, one influencing the other. And so, of course, as a young boy, my first real, addiction in reading was the Hardy Boys series.
Yes, I remember them.
And the Hardy Boys and the Nancy Drew for the boys and girls back then. We divided those things. But there were more than 50 Hardy Boys novels. And I went through a summer where I read one a day. And I would send my father back to the bookstore every morning. You got to go get me another one. And,
Fortunately, you picked one where there was a lot of them.
Yes, right, exactly. Then discovered Ian Fleming's James Bond and reading through those, the mystery novels of Agatha Christie. And of course, you're learning as a young person the foundations of mythology, Greek and Roman mythology, and enjoying that. And you're beginning to watch movies and things. And so as a young person, falling in love very quickly with storytelling and language itself. And that really is the love that was driving me forward. Each time you'd read something, you'd start to write in a slightly different way, or you'd try to write a mystery story, try to write a suspense piece. Science fiction, I discovered the short stories of Ray Bradbury, the great American science fiction writer, and dabbled in that. But then goes for all of us, around 16, 17 years old, you are assigned a work which is of greater substance, take your pick, whether it's Edith Wharton or Mark Twain's Huckleberry Finn, or it's the Odyssey for the first time, reading it in its full language. And then while you're reading a work like that, then I remember that feeling of being like, okay, I've loved storytelling, I've loved language, I get it, but this is a whole nother level of understanding of what the form is capable of. When you read Dostoevsky or you read Henry James, you just understand the scope of the project and the artistic impact of it, the emotional impact of it, poetics at their maximum. And then your ambitions shift. You're like, okay, this is the game I'm in. It's not mystery stories. It's not short stories and science fiction. It's this. And from then on, you start to read more seriously and you are retooling your writing as you go, trying to master elements of craft, both as a reader and as a practitioner of writing from that point forward.
Yeah. Who first spotted your talent for writing?
This would be true for any young person who's discovered a passion that they also have ability in, whether that's gymnastics or the violin or acting or whatever the category, that the tears of that, meaning in the early stages, your parents are like, oh, how terrific. And, you do this quite well. And they're enthusiastic and supportive of it. And then you get to high school and maybe you have a teacher who says, oh, Amor, this is really quite, you get a good grade in it, or you get good feedback, or you get an uncle who, who likes it or is impressed or comes to the performance, a relative who you respect a little bit more. Their praise matters a little bit more, say, oh, that was really quite something. But it really, for me, was in college when I was at Yale, where there was a professor, well, not a professor really, he was a famous American writer of fiction and nonfiction named Peter Matheson. He came to teach for a semester. He's the only American who won the National Book Award in the United States for both fiction and nonfiction at two different times, which no one has done. It's very rare to excel at that level in both of those forms. And so he came to teach, and I got into his seminar, and he was really the first person who took me aside and said, Amor, I think you could be very gifted at this. I'm going to take your time with me very seriously. I hope you're going to take your time with me very seriously too. The little bits of praise you've gotten from teachers or cousins, my uncles and aunts, whatever, have helped you along the way. But that's when suddenly you feel like someone who you're not related to and who you respect their work and you respect them as an individual and they single you out. That's a whole different kind of support. That's the kind of thing that you don't need to have happen every year. It's the kind of thing that you need to have happen maybe every 10 years, because that one statement by Peter was an encouragement that lasted at least a decade.
After Yale, I think I'm right in saying that you then went and received a Master of Arts degree in English from Stanford University. And there seemed to be, from what I've read, various plans. There was a plan that you were going to teach in China. You were planning to be a writer. And then you didn't plan to move to New York City until the day that you actually did move to New York City. So what set of events from university and having that overriding feeling that you wanted to be a writer, and what led you into the investment world?
What happened to me is I did, as you say, after finishing at Stanford and getting my master's in English and literature, I was going to go to China to teach for 2 years for Yale. It just so happened that I moved to New Haven, where there was going to be training for the summer. And then the whole group of us were going to be sent as a part of a program that had existed at Yale in mainland China since the early 20th century and existed right through the Cultural Revolution, actually, amazingly. And so it's a very long-standing program. But it just so happened that I was doing it in 1989, and that was when the spring of Tiananmen Square. And so at the time, for the first time ever, Yale decided we're not going to send you. And they gave us each a check for $5,000 and said, good luck. And so I had this plan for the next 2 years that suddenly evaporated. And I called a buddy of mine, a childhood friend in New York. And I said, I just got booted out of this program, but given $5,000. And he's like, oh, what a coincidence, because I need a roommate. So I've been here ever since, whatever it is now, 35 years later. I came here with the assumption that I was going to become a writer, but I was in the early stages, at the age of 25, feeling a little frustrated, a little lonely, a little claustrophobic. I wasn't making the progress I would have liked in my own art, setting aside the external world. And I was broke, more importantly. And so I ended up joining a friend of mine who had started an investment firm, and we worked together side by side for 21 years. And for the first 10 years, I stopped writing fiction while we were building the firm, but I knew that I needed to circle back to that or I would end up miserable. And so in my mid 30s, I began writing again. And I wrote a book over 7 years that I didn't like and set that aside. And I learned a lot from that process. I then wrote another work, and that was Rules of Civility. And when that became a bestseller, I retired from the firm and I've been writing full time ever since.
Well, it's thanks to Laura McKenna that we're having this conversation today from
Yes,
Select
of course.
Equity. And in fact, I didn't meet Laura, my husband Simon did. But
Okay.
she said that when you were in the investment world, your investment letters were incredibly sought after and admired because you wrote
This
them
is not
so
true.
well.
This is an old friend and an old colleague putting frosting on the cake that's not there. So, I mean, what's being mentioned here is that this is totally unimportant aside. My younger sister also went to Yale. I went to her graduation. And at the graduation, there was a party afterwards where all the parents were gone, but it was the graduating class and their siblings and their friends. And so I ended up befriending and danced all night with this terrific young woman. We never dated, but this terrific young woman who was the older sister of another kid in the class, one of my sister's friends. And when I moved to New York, she moved to New York and she had a job. I did not. So I was like, we would have like lunch and she was, I think she would look at me and be like, what are you doing? Gotta get your act together, mister. And so she certainly wasn't going to date me as some drifty, unemployed writer type from the East Village. So then years went by and we maintained a friendship. And then suddenly she had been in the investment profession and was looking to go to a different kind of investment environment than she'd been in. And we recruited her. So she suddenly was a colleague of mine and eventually a partner of mine professionally. And so we know each other very well and have worked alongside together for a long time. But the truth is, there is no connection between my fiction writing and the world of the investment business. There's none. What happened there hasn't affected my fiction, nor did my fiction improve my execution there. They are two different worlds.
I want to talk about your books. Your ideas are so varied. One of your books is about a Russian aristocrat whose prison is the Metropole Hotel in Moscow. Another is about a young working woman in Rules of Civility in the late 1930s. Another is about a juvenile returning from a reform prison school. Then there's your book of short stories, all of which are so mutually exclusive and wide-ranging. So can you take us through the steps from the first germ of an idea that you have through to publication?
What you're asking me to do is distill 6 years into 6 months.
Yes.
No,
Sorry.
that's fine. I'm kidding. That's true. The first thing I have to say is because I've been writing fiction since I was a kid, I have ideas all the time. All my life, I've had ideas for stories. This is what you do when you read and write and dream about it. Invention is what you do when your mind is idle. And what'll happen for me as in sort of the adult phase of my life is I have an idea that's intriguing. You can usually describe the premise in a sentence, like a guy gets trapped in a hotel for a long period of time. That was the sentence that I began with that became A Gentleman in Moscow. And it was just guy in a hotel. When I have an idea like that, I'm like, oh, that's interesting. Yeah, that could work. If I make that step, then usually what happens really is in a matter of minutes, I know a lot about it. So in that case, within minutes of having the idea, I was like, oh yeah, this could be in Russia. It could be an aristocrat sentenced to house arrest in a fine hotel across the street from the Kremlin. It could begin right after the revolution. It could go all the way to the Cold War. And then I started even begin to see some of the different participants in the story and how it might unfold. In the course of, let's say, the first 48 hours.
Wow, you've come up with all of that in 48 hours.
Well, everything so far is in the first couple, let's say the first 20 minutes, 30 minutes. Then you start to build it. So you say, okay, and usually in like a 48 hours, 72 hours, I have a scaffolding. In practical terms, what's happening, he's going to sentence to house arrest for this reason. And he's going to meet a young girl. He's going to feel frustrated, meet a young girl. Oh, he's going to become a waiter. That's a good idea. Yeah, I'll become a waiter in a hotel. And then I'll have a nemesis. Yeah, the nemesis will be this. And there'll be a security officer who comes and interviews him and they become friends. And so all that stuff, as I say, the scaffolding of it, that I'll sketch out over the course of, say, 72 hours.
Wow.
But That's all the easy part. And so what then happens is I go into what I call a design phase where I'll spend 2, 3, 4 years filling notebooks by hand, where I then start take that scaffolding and begin to imagine it fully. So, all right, what is the actual sequence of events that happens, large and small? What are the settings and what do they look like? What are the characters? What are their backgrounds? What are their personalities? What are the actual events that trigger things? What are the objects in the room and why do they matter? What memories from the character's past are going to resurface and why? What is the tone of this all? What are some of the philosophical elements that might surface? What are some of the conversations that might be had? And all that's being done by hand over a period of years, not necessarily in chronological order. Could be think about this part of the book now and then think about that part of the book later and dig into it. I might be writing the opening paragraphs of whole chapters. So taking a stab at, okay, yeah, the chapter that's going to deal with X. How's it going to open? What's the tone of the opening of that sequence? And so I'll experiment with that kind of thing and took different shots at it. And eventually, after a couple of years, I get to the point where I feel like I know the majority of what's going to happen and what it's going to sound like and the tone of the book and everything else and the people and the places. And then I'll outline the book. So I feel like I'm ready. I'll outline it in detail. And only then would I begin chapter 1.
When you outline it, is that still in book form?
Shifting to digital file. I mean, I'm writing on a computer at that point. An outline has to be a living document, or should be. So you don't want to do it by hand because you're moving parts around as you rethink it and you're adding sections and taking sections out. And even as you're doing the work, once I start writing, the back half of the outline is changing all the time in response to the writing of the front half of the book, because I'm learning better and better understanding of where this is all going and why. The outline is a Word file on a computer so that it is, as I say, a living document, right till the end.
So in terms of research,
I'm not a research-driven guy. I mean, I'll do some things, but it's not really my focus. Most of it's in the invention from my imagination. But I only will write things where I feel comfortable imagining them from scratch. So I had read a lot of Russian literature over the course of 25 to 30 years. I'd read some Russian history. I'd studied Russian artistic movements as a fan. And so that's why when I had the idea for a guy trapped in a hotel, I was like, let's set it in Russia. I could have set that story in China, where house arrest still exists today. I could have set it in Pinochet in the South America in Pinochet's time. But I don't know those places in the same way. So I would never do that. Those would have required research in the traditional sense. I'm just not interested in that. So, and the same thing like writing Lincoln Highway is set in the mid 50s. People my age know a great deal about the 50s because it's when our parents came of age. It's a rule of human life that the time from when we're 10 to 20, let's say, is a time of where it has great influence on us. We know what happens in the world economically, sociopolitically, artistically. While we're 10 to 20, we carry with us for the rest of our life and shapes a lot of our thinking and behavior. Well, the second most influential time in our lives is probably when our parents were 10 to 20. It wasn't when we were 20 to 30 or when we were 5 to, it was when they were. Because when they were 10 to 20, they got shaped and they shaped us with all that.
yes,
That's what
true.
their stories and their ethics and their everything else is tied to. And so as kids, we're 0 to 10, we're kind of taking in that decade, but what we're really taking in is this decade from when our parents were young. So it's very easy to write about the 50s because, again, that was my parents' era.
Those initial 72 hours when you're thinking of an idea and you're coming up with how you could sort of scaffold it and how you could put it all together. Do you have a lot of those that you then discard?
I don't ever really discard anything, but there's many of them accumulating and they won't all become books. And when I'm finishing one book and thinking about the next, I'll look across different things I have in development.
Then you start writing. How long will that first draft?
I'd like the first draft to be a year and a half about. And then it'll take me another year or more to revise from beginning to end a couple of times.
A former guest, Santa Montefiore, who's a writer, she says that her philosophy is get it down and then get it right. So the beautiful prose that you write, is that tends to be in the revision or is that as you go along initially?
First of all, I know the Montefiores and think they're both terrific. Love them
Oh,
both.
do you? Yes, they're great friends of mine. Didn't realize you knew them.
Yes, but they're grand. I've known Simon longer, but I know them both. And I think this is true for most people. It's a combination. So sometimes when I'm writing in my notebook, there'll be a paragraph where I can move that into the document later, almost word for word, and it just came out right the first time. Is that the most common? No. What's more common is that there's a paragraph which is headed in the right direction, and but it's incomplete, or it incorporates something that shouldn't be there and it's failing to incorporate something that should, and the sentences aren't scanning quite right. It's not in the tone it should be, that the metaphor that was used in the fifth sentence is flat-footed. A lot of that is rereading and rewriting and rereading and rewriting and rereading, which I do a ton of. God bless when you have those paragraphs that are perfect. The things about those paragraphs is very often they punch above their weight because they may be the kind of paragraph that tells you what the whole chapter should sound like. So even though each other paragraph is going to take more work to create, if it weren't for that first paragraph that just sort of bursts out, you'd be struggling to figure out where is this all going. You can have this sui generis bit of writing that is not only good in itself, but sets the standard or the tone for what the writing around it should be like, because it nails the tone of that moment, or nails the character's voice, or nails the perspective of what you're trying to get across, any of those things.
When you have revised it, do you have a first reader? What happens then?
All writers are different about this. I don't share while I'm writing the first draft. So I'll write the first draft. I'll then write through it once, meaning I'll take another crack at sort of cleaning it up and getting it the way it should be. And then I'll share it to 4, 5, 6 people simultaneously. And then I'll ask them all to read it in the first 60 days. And then after 30 days, I'll start setting up lunches with the group of them, one after another. The ideal is to meet with all 5 or 6 people, one after the other, in a span of, say, 2 to 3 weeks, where I can interview them about the experience of reading it, what worked and what didn't, what they didn't get and what they didn't like, and what really tickled their fancy, whatever. And people respond to that differently. Some people want to talk about big, mile high sort of view stuff, and some people get into the nitty gritty of it, and that's fine. You just sort of want a variety of responses to compare as I begin to plan what the revision is going to be like, because I don't revise lightly. The revision of the first draft is not a matter of simply pruning sentences. It is, I am prepared to meaningfully restructure aspects of the story, eliminate a character, eliminate an event, introduce a new character, shift the timeline, to cut the first 50 pages, all those kinds of things that are sort of more dramatic in their scope. But I really value that first revision where your big things might happen, because as you go from there and start to revise, you are beginning to winnow the scope of change that you're targeting. You hope you are, because God forbid you get to the third draft and you're like, oh, half of this book sucks. You know? I've had that feeling like a year before, but hopefully it is winnowing because the thing is getting closer to what it should be.
And it was interesting for me because I write, and so I'm always fascinated by how other people do it. I could wallpaper my entire house with rejection letters. In terms of your debut novel, Rules of Civility, as I say, I've just finished it. It is an absolute gem of a novel. And the protagonist is Katie. She's a young, bright, feisty woman in New York set in the late 1930s. And how you inhabit her mind so perfectly is quite extraordinary. What stage did you find an agent?
To set it up, I guess I mentioned that I wrote this book for 7 years I didn't like, so I never submitted that to anybody. It did its job. So, but when I wrote Rules of Civility, I was like, oh yeah, okay, this is good enough. But at that point, I was in my 40s, and I'd lived in New York for 20 years, let's say, or close to it. In the course, if you've lived in London, wherever, San Francisco, take your pick, you know a lot of people, and you know people who are in different fields. So I knew friends who were editors. I had friends who were agents. I had friends who were writers. And so I could go to a handful and say, listen, I've just written this and I'm trying to decide what to do next with it. You know, could you give me any of your thoughts or feedback? And that did include editors, writers, agents. And one of those agents was like, this book is definitely going to be published, and I hope you'll come to our agency. And she had said at the beginning, I don't work with friends. And so she stuck with it. It's still true, as much as I love this, but I'll introduce you to people who are going to want to work with you. And so that was the dynamic. And so, yes, then I ended up with an agent through that. And The book was sold at auction in New York City.
Wow, it was sold at auction.
I shouldn't skip over this. What ended up happening is that first lunch that I had with my friend who was the agent who would not take me on, she said, "Hey, listen, do you have opinions about how to make this better already?" And I said, "Well, yeah, this and this and this." And she said, "Okay. And you've been talking to people?" And I said, "Yes." She said, "Listen, I got to tell you, the chances of you getting the best possible agent in my firm increase if you're willing to do some of that work before we share it." She's like, "I'll share it when you want me to share it." And I said, "Okay, yeah, no, that makes sense. So let me go back and I'll go back to work on it." But I had a job, I had kids. So it took me a year, I think, to get back to her. And so she then shared it. I got my agent, and my agent said the same thing to me. My brand new agent said, "Hey, this is great, but you're going to get this published. You're going to get it sold. The question is, how good is the house? How good is the buying editor? How much money do you get, et cetera? And so if you think you can improve this, would you be up for doing a round of improvement before I start to try to place it?" And I said, yes. And it took a year. So another year went by.
The worry is that they're giving conflicting advice.
Yeah, in neither case was it really hinging on their opinion about what the book should be. It was more on, do you think that you could make it better based on what you think?
Okay.
I was like, I'm going to go back and work on it. It took me a year. I thought there's a possibility I'd come back to her and she'd be like, "Wait, what?" I don't remember this. And then when Dorian, my agent, said, "No, I really want to work with you, well, go fix it a little bit or improve it." And that took a year. I thought that at the end of the year, she could be fired. She could quit. She could lose interest in me. You never know. So each time I went back to my office, it was a little bit like, oh, this could go south, but it's the right thing to do. And I do think for those of you who are unpublished writers who want to write, not that my advice is worth anything, but
yes, it is.
In the modern era, if you go back 100 years ago to the 1920s, Maxwell Perkins was probably the greatest of the American editors of that era. He edited Fitzgerald, he edited Hemingway, he edited Don Powell, all these incredible American writers. And if you go back and look at their correspondence, he and Fitzgerald were writing long letters to each other back and forth about a chapter, about a paragraph, about the themes, about motifs. I mean, it's incredible back and forth. And that really doesn't exist today. And it partly doesn't exist because the editors who now work for much bigger corporations are responsible for publishing far more books in any given year. So what that means is that a higher and higher and higher premium is placed on a book that is pulled together.
Yeah.
A sad aspect of that is that a buying editor today is more likely to be interested in an average book that's very well executed than an extraordinary book that's a mess. Back in the old days, you could say, okay, this is an extraordinary voice, it's a mess, and I'm going to spend 3 years helping this author figure this out. That happens today, but it just happens a lot less frequently. And an editor might be willing to take on one of those relationships every 5 years. And then the others puts all the more pressure on the person to have polished work. So that time that both Jennifer and Dorian were encouraging me to spend back in private was very valuable in that it was still my work. I was still making all the decisions, but I was forcing myself to push the work up another step of the ladder in terms of how effectively it was achieved as a form of art. I'd say as long as we're in the advice category, I don't want to be misinterpreted in this. At no point in these conversations, either with these people or then with my editors later, at no point was commercial viability ever discussed. So
really,
you have to really understand that publishing industry and the agency world, for all of its flaws, it knows when something is headed for a commercial goal and when something is not, and it tends to respect those boundaries very well. So meaning, if you have a young writer who's like, I want to write spy fiction and I want to have a bestseller and I want it to be turned into movies, you're like, okay, let's go. And the advice can be shaped along those lines. And conversations could be around who's your audience? And are you sure this part's not going to alienate people? And do people are going to understand this part? If you say, I'm trying to write literature here, the whole conversation changes. It's not about how can we sell it and who's your audience. It's about what are you trying to achieve artistically? And does this fulfill that ambition or not? And what parts of it are obstacles in fulfilling its artistic goal? So most of this work that I'm talking about is of that shape. It's not a shape of trying to make something which is going to ring a cash register.
Yeah. Your book has done incredibly well. It was your debut novel. It was a New York Times bestseller. It was named one of the best books of 2011 by the Wall Street Journal. By the time it got to publication, were you expecting it to do this well?
Uh, the reality is that you're getting signals along the way that are increasingly revealing. And so it's not like a gender reveal party. Like, oh, balloon explodes, it's a boy. It's not like what happens is that your agent is a well-read person and say, hey, listen, this has really got potential. And then you're trying to sell it and there's active interest. Okay, well, that's a signal. But then once you sold it, even then there's tears because what happens in the industry is that standard practice with a literary novel is that you have a finished manuscript, which is then printed as a paperback, which we call an advanced reader's copy, at least 6 months before publication day. They may print 500 of them, they print 5,000 of them, depending upon a variety of factors. But that advanced reader's copy is then distributed to the press, to magazines, but also, and more importantly, particularly in the United States, to the book-selling community. So the head of fiction at the local independent bookstores across the country, the head of fiction at Barnes & Noble, the head of fiction at Amazon, but all the small independents across the country. And they can give feedback, not directly to you, but to the house. They may send an email to the house saying, oh my God, because they're reading all of printed materials 6 months in advance. Whatever you're talking about, they read 6 months ago. And they're sifting through it, trying to figure out for their customers what's of interest, what's different, what's new, what's refreshing, what's topical. And keep in mind, they're doing that for an enormous variety of readers. So they have science fiction readers, they have teenagers, they have old gray-haired men who only read books about World War II. And so they're reading it all and as quickly as they can as a team, each independent bookstore, and then they say, oh my God, this thing is really something. So those come through. And this is all long before publication day. And so that's a case where your editor could say, hey, listen, I got to tell you, we really love this, but the feedback we're getting from the independent bookstores is really positive. And of course, it could be the opposite.
Yes.
It could be they hate it. But either way, you're recalibrating as information is accumulating. And the irony here, or I know it's not ironic because it's obvious in a way, is that the farther you're getting away from your office, the more valuable the feedback is, meaning you and your family, not important. So it's a little bit more important than your family. Your agent still works for you. Helpful, but your publisher, well, they just paid for it. And then eventually you get to the bookstore people and they don't owe me anything. They have only one interest, and that's finding something that they think readers are going to enjoy in their store, period. And so that's the case where you're really getting the most genuine feedback in this long process. And that's actually very predictive too, that particular feedback.
That's so interesting. I had no idea about that whole process. So thank you. But it does superbly well. You then move on to A Gentleman in Moscow. That was the book that I read first. So many superlatives to put with this book. Was there anything that triggered this extraordinary idea?
Sometimes it is out of the ether, and sometimes it is in response to something. And in this case, I had professionally gone to the same hotel in Geneva every year for 8 years and stayed there for a week as I met with clients in Geneva. And I was walking into the hotel one year, and in the lobby was a guy from the year before. I was like, oh, that's a guy who lives in a hotel. That's what got me started.
And then Count Rostov has this amazing relationship with this young girl who's also a guest in the hotel, Nina, and then subsequently her daughter, Sophia. And those relationships are so tender and heartwarming. I didn't know whether that was drawn from anything from reality or that was, again, just you thinking that because it was such a great storyline.
It's important to remember that very young artists can generate work which is surprisingly mature in its content. Let's just, as an extreme example, the Beatles broke up before they were 30. The entire Beatles oeuvre was largely written before they were 27. Eleanor Rigby standing by the grave, waiting in the rain, and nobody came. The fact that they are young makes no difference, poses no obstacle for their ability to tune into the human experience in a way that is grand in scope. Fitzgerald is an American, of course, did all of his best writing long before he was 40. Hemingway did his best work as a young man. There's some great American and European writers who wrote late in life too. Tolstoy was doing very interesting work later in life. So it's not prohibitive, but it's absolutely true that the human mind and the human, call it the tuning fork, the emotive tuning fork, is such that a very young person can be taking in human experience, interpreting it through their own emotional range in a way that is very authentic, even if they have failed to have the experience.
There's another former guest on the show and another master writer like you is Patrick Gale. A couple of his books are from multiple viewpoints, which I'm going to come back to. But he said that there was a study shown about, they took a whole group of people who just read novels and then a group of people who wrote nonfiction. And the empathy from those who were reading the fiction was just so far elevated to the others. So the more you read, the more you can see that those different viewpoints and you absorb that without actually having to have experienced those things yourself. So he was in absolute agreement. And I had another question that was actually based on the way that he does things, because when he does multiple viewpoints, which you have done in the Lincoln Highway, and I'm sorry, I'm hopping around your books here now, which is not necessarily the right way of doing it. But anyway, I loved that book. All your characters were so lovable. And every time I got to the end of a chapter, I thought, oh, it's Wooly is the next one. And oh, it's Emmett, and it's going to be Ulysses or Billy. So every single one of them, I was excited to hear from. The way that he does it in his books is that he says he writes the chapters just of one character, so he can concentrate on being just them. And then he'll go on to the next one and just inhabit them for a while and so on. And then he'll mix up the chapters at the end. How do you draw these characters so well?
I did not do that, but I understand the concept, of course. He's absolutely right. That's an aspect of the challenge. We've got different challenges. His challenge is if he's writing one character straight through, he doesn't have the advantage of writing that character's last chapters, having written all these other things that are going to come before it. If you're writing everybody's last chapter last, then each of those chapters can be informed by all that has happened to all the characters and to the reader up until that moment. So the challenge I have is the one that you're describing, which is that I'm going to keep shifting, but moving the story forward as the reader's going to be reading it. When I shift, I'm going to have to take a moment and make sure that I'm back in the vibe of character number 5. Lincoln Highway is told from 8 perspectives. So shifting is a meaningful dynamic because you might have just spent months writing from 7 other perspectives, and now you're back again. So you do have to go back, and I might go back, for instance, and read every chapter by that character so far as a way of getting me back in tune with what this next chapter is going to sound like. Of course, I do all the planning in advance. So I also know what each character is going to be doing later on. So I'm not inventing that. The thread of the character's activity has already been determined. But making sure that you get the language right is a matter of immersion. And it's really different writers are going to choose which challenge is the better challenge to take on.
I have one observation about the main characters that you have that I wanted to ask you about, and that is that none of them ever moan or complain, from what I've observed. Certainly not the ones whose point of view that we see. Not Alexander Rostov, who's stuck in a hotel for 30 years, not Katie, who meets the love of her life and then there's an accident that prevents her from being with him. I think, in fact, the closest we get to her moaning is that when there's a potential engagement, her cheeks burn. Not Duchess in the Lincoln Highway, who's just been dealt a dreadful set of cards. Emmett, similarly. So you show the problems, the injustices, the betrayals, but you don't dwell on them, and then your characters don't wallow in them. I wondered, is that a conscious decision?
No, it's not a conscious decision. I don't think anyone's ever said that to me, and nor have I really thought about it. But thinking about it off the top of my head, I think complaining is boring. Having someone complain to you. But imagine the person complaining about the same thing every day. You'd be like, just change for Christ's sake. I don't want to hear about it. So I think as a storyteller, you got to choose your moments of complaint. I have characters who are snarky. I have characters who are critical of what other people are doing or who are critical of their own actions. We tend to be selective about how much we're willing to complain about. We'll say to our spouse, that this really drives me crazy. And then you can let it drop. Because I think we all know that, as I say, complaining about the same thing all the time, we'd be by ourselves pretty quickly. So I think it's kind of natural as a storyteller to move on from that quickly to see where it goes.
And in fact, I think from what that sounds is that that's how you deal with your own life, setbacks in your own life, is you
Maybe.
just carry on regardless. Gentleman in Moscow, I'm so sorry, Amor, I'm going all over the place. It was made into a television series. I don't want to dwell on it because I know that you weren't an integral part of the making of it. But Ewan McGregor was in it, Mary
Yeah.
Elizabeth Winstead. And I really do think that's the role of his career. I think he did it absolutely brilliantly. When I asked Bonnie Garmus about the televised version of Lessons in Chemistry, she said that she could barely watch it. She said, I felt I was going to have heart failure. They changed it so much. I wondered how you found it watching it.
I think everybody feels that way. It has to be adapted. I mean, that's the nature of the shift in art form. But more than that, the reality is it's a creative team who's taking on the work and they want to change it. And not because it needs to be changed, but because it's exciting for them to change it.
Right.
They're people who are paid for their imagination, for their witticisms, for their dialogue writing, for their whatever else. And so they don't want to sit back and put all that stuff on the back shelf and just dutifully type out what my thought. So when you bring in a whole new group of artists to adapt, you're opening the door for them to pursue their own instincts and their own whims, what they think they're good at. And so, yeah, that's going to be frustrating for any author to view it. I feel very lucky. I think in Gentleman Moscow, the team hewed to the most important defining characteristics of the tale. You've already pointed out the greatest of breaks, which is Ewan's decision to do it, because he's fantastic, both as an actor, as a person, but also in this role in particular. I mean, I really can't imagine anybody doing a better job
No.
of bringing my character to life. I mean, really, he was fantastic. The set is incredible and was made with great care and thoughtfulness with the book in regard. Were decisions made that irk me and that seem unnecessary or misguided? Of course. But I do feel that in the case of John Moscow, it was 8 out of 10 decisions were the right one. So you're very lucky to be in that sphere.
Yeah.
But the book's better.
Yes, it is.
I love Ewan, but Ewan, the book's better. I'm sorry.
Okay. Back to the Lincoln Highway. We touched on it. Did you drive the Lincoln Highway?
The Lincoln Highway was the first paved road that crossed the United States. What's interesting about it, because this is very contrary to what would have occurred in Europe for sure, is that in 1910, as the car was coming of age, there was no paved road that crossed the United States. And more importantly, the federal government in America was not involved in road creation at all. So all roads were local. And there was an American entrepreneur who had made a fortune in a couple of different ways, who was a car enthusiast, who said there should be a road that crosses the country so that Americans can drive across America and see this great nation. And so he did it himself. He raised money from the public and he went from town to town raising money, and he convinced corporations and famous people to give him money. And he gathered all this money together and then he did it. He built this first paved road across the country, which again, I can't imagine that there's a parallel in Europe of an individual doing something like that. Rome did it. The emperor did it, stuff like that. And so this road existed. It was the most famous road in America in the 1920s and the 30s and the 40s. In the 1950s, the American modern highway system was built by the federal government. And a lot of these older highways became obsolete. They went through smaller towns. They were only one lane wide in each direction. They weren't built for large trucks, things like that. And the Lincoln Highway is like that. It still exists in the United States. You can drive all the way from Times Square in New York, where it begins, to the Pacific Ocean in San Francisco, where it ends. But it's through small towns, and it's basically a direct line. It's very straight, but it's slower. But at any rate, so I had never heard of the road when I was writing the book. I discovered the road while I was writing the book. Did I drive on it? Yes, but not until I had written the first draft, because that's typical for me. I'd never spent a night in the Metropole Hotel until I wrote the first draft of A Gentleman in Moscow. And I'd never driven on the Lincoln Highway until I'd finished the first draft of the Lincoln Highway. Because again, I like to put research after my imagination. I don't like it to be the tail that wags the dog. I want it to help me later once I've already done the storytelling in its completest form.
Okay. When it comes to your endings? Is that something that evolves as you write, or do you know how your stories are going to end in that initial phase?
There's a lot of evolution, both as I'm planning and as I'm writing, because I'm getting a better sense of how the story should be told, regardless of what I thought initially. But the ending has rarely changed. John Mosca, the ending was as I thought of it from the beginning. Same thing in the Lincoln Highway, same thing in Rules of Civility. I always saw those books ending exactly as they ended. For whatever reason, those are where they landed as I assumed they would.
Okay. The reason I ask is my husband has just finished the Lincoln Highway. In fact, we would have been great adverts because I was reading Rules of Civility and he was reading the Lincoln Highway. So we were both with our books in the evening reading. And he has a completely different, I don't think I'm spoiling anything for anyone who has yet to read the Lincoln Highway, but what happens to those two boys afterwards? We completely disagree as to what happens after the book. Some books just tie every knot and that's how it ends. Whereas there is huge scope at the end of Lincoln Highway and in Rules of Civility. There are some unanswered questions that you leave to the reader.
I think in the case of the Lincoln Highway, there was enough public debate about certain aspects of the end and people reaching out to me that I keep at amortowles.com. There's a Q&A for each of the books. And at the bottom of the Q&As, there's usually answers to frequently asked questions. And one of the questions was, okay, what is my take on the ending of the Lincoln Highway? And what are the implications of some of the things that had occurred in the final 50 pages? And so I do share that. Your husband could agree with me or be like, no, and whatever, that's fine too. Together, you may find that interesting as a way
of absolutely
forming your debate because there was heated enough. It's funny, if a book is successful, then there's enough readers that virtually every interpretation is going to be out there. And that's okay.
Table for Two, book of short stories and a novella. What made you decide to write a book of short stories?
I've been writing short stories since the beginning. And like most fiction writers, you tend to get your start. I don't mean professionally, I mean artistically, writing short stories because they're the perfect form in which to experiment with different elements of craft. I've written, whatever, hundreds of short stories over the course of my life. It's a natural thing to turn back to. Everything in Table for Two was written in the last 10 years. It wasn't like it was a collection of stuff I wrote when I was younger. It is all contemporary, but it's the kind of thing that occasionally I'll sit down and do because I have an idea which is compelling but doesn't belong as a novel. It really belongs as a shorter story.
I love The Stepfather, who wasn't having an affair. I don't think I'm going to give anything away with that. Yep. I love Mr. Fane, who was recording the concert.
Bootlegger.
Yes, I had to look that up. I didn't realize that was what it was called. And I love your description of Thomas the banker. I think I've met quite a few of those. I just want to also mention the novella, which I think was really interesting. And because I did everything the wrong way around, I read this book and I happened to be in Mustang in Nepal, and I was in a tent every night with a woolly hat on and my head torch. And I was reading the novella part and I was having to change my hands because my hands were getting so cold holding the book. So anyway, that's just a measure of how much I was enjoying your book.
That's a great image. Thank you.
But at the end of it, I was thinking, why did she have this scar? Why does this girl have this scar? And then I was a bit peeved and I thought, oh, you haven't explained it. And then it wasn't until I then moved on to Rules of Civility that I realized that you answered my question.
Yes.
So what made you bring Evelyn Ross back to life?
As you discovered in your backwards way, she's a central character in Rules of Civility. She's the main character's best friend. In the course of Rules of Civility, as you mentioned earlier, she does get in an accident where she is disfigured. She has a relationship that comes unwound. She's not really turned on professionally. And so having moved from the Midwest to New York City, she basically says, all right, I'm getting out of here. Katie says, what are you going to do? And she says, I'm going to go home to Indiana, see the folks. She's a very spunky, independent-minded, hilarious character. And I was writing the sequence where she was going to be arriving at the train station in Chicago to be picked up by her parents. I was like, oh my God, she would never do that. She would never get off this train. So on the spur of the moment while writing that novel, I said she extended her ticket to Los Angeles and disappeared into Hollywood in 1938. But so when Rules of Civility was finished and came out, I was very interested in what happened to Eve in Hollywood. And I began to imagine very quickly. 10 years ago, I wrote a small piece, it was 50 pages, where you see 5 people that Eve encounters in the course of her first 90 days in Los Angeles. Retired homicide detective whom she meets on the train, and then an old overweight actor who lives in a fancy hotel, and then Olivia de Havilland, the movie star. It's from each of their perspectives, meeting her, and you get a sense of impact that she's had on them, however tenuous. That was it. I wrote it. It was 50 pages. I added that to this collection 2 years ago when I was putting it together. And then when I submitted it to my editor, I thought, you know what? You got to give it back to me because I'm not done with Eve. The 50 pages isn't enough. In the 10 years between writing those 50 pages and now, I had continued to think about her and what she would be doing in Hollywood. And I felt like the reader deserves to hear all of it. So I opened up the story again, and now it's 200 pages. And you really get to see, you don't just get the glimpse of her impact on these various people, you really get to see it sort of beginning to come to fruition, the material way in which this energetic, willful character who's been through difficult times herself, how her personality, just by force of personality, could alter the lives of others. And eventually she has to decide what she's going to do with her own life. And the extended book does a much better job of that as well. So it ended up being, I think, a lot of fun. It's a noir. It's written in a noirish style. And so it's very different in flavor in a way than the rest of my work, but I think it's a lot of fun.
It's great. It's so twisty and turny. And I was hooked to the point that I was happy to freeze my arm off to find out what was going to happen next.
Touched.
Am I right in saying that you are now working on another novel that's set in Cairo?
Yes. Well, I'm working on a novel that opens in Cairo at the end of the Second World War, but it ends in New York in 1999. And that's about all I will tell you about that.
Okay, fine. Looking back on your life, is there any advice you would give to a young Amor Towles?
Well, I kind of implied it in the description of my own development. It sounds really stupid and pithy, but it really is read, write, repeat, because that's the whole thing. There's no writer of significance who I know who is not a reader. It's the moving back and forth between the two that ultimately is the best way for writers to fashion their craft. And that's been true since the beginning.
In an interview you did with John Grisham, you said that you like your work to be well received now, but you don't necessarily see it being well received in the future. But I would say, was that not what you said? Not necessarily for generations to come?
We joke, he's the one who says, I don't give a damn what my books happen when I'm dead. I'm here for my audience now, and whether my books survive a day after I'm dead, I couldn't care less. And I am the opposite. I'm not thinking interested in fame or fama in the classical sense of reputation outlasting the mortal body. But I'm interested in books that last in England, the United States, pick your country. The books that survive, why did they survive? Why do we read Jane Austen today? Why do we read Shakespeare today? Why do we read Cervantes? What is it about those books and the way they're written that allows them to be read generation after generation with great interest? And for me, having a book survive my lifetime is not important to me from a fame standpoint. It's important to me as a target, because a book that could do that would be a book that is well written at the highest level. So yeah, the ambition is to create literature that outlasts my lifetime, because I think it's the greatest of artistic goals.
Well, there is very much a timeless quality about it. And I think that's sort of what partly sets you apart from other writers, is that on the one hand, I want to devour the story, but I'm also in a state of wonder in terms of the beauty of the prose and the way that you describe something. Anyway, the world is a better place thanks to the great storytellers, and you are right at the top of that list. So thank you so much. And I have been so looking forward to talking to you today, and you've been just so generous with your time. So thanks so much, Amor.
Thanks for having me, Katie. My pleasure. And happy holidays.
Happy holidays to you too. You've been listening to Bandwidth Conversations. Thanks to Anna B., Head of Marketing, to all at the podcast consultant, to Bagawire for the music, to the Money Maze podcast. Thank you for listening. Any feedback, please email me, katie@bandwidthconversations.com. Please sign up on our website, www.bandwidthconversations.com, so we can notify you about new podcast releases. We hope to see you again soon.